Ever since playing the Persona series of RPGs, I've seen a lot of RPGs that are similar to them, or at least try to be. One of those games released on the PlayStation Vita a few years ago called the Caligula effect. Outside of just being a similar game, it was actually written by the same person who wrote the first 3 Persona games. After it didn't do nearly as well as people thought it would, they decided to completely redo the game in Unreal Engine, add a bunch of new features, and release it on newer consoles. Now available in the handheld community for the second time, here is my review of the Caligula Effect Overdose for the Nintendo Switch. In this story, you play as a high school student going through their daily life, until you realize you're not in the real world anymore. You are trapped in a virtual world called Mobius, created to help people escape the pain of their lives. And upon meeting some other self-aware people inside Mobius, you realize that the entity is dead set on keeping you there forever, essentially trapping you against your will. The main plot of this game basically revolves around 2 factions. The Go Home Club is the faction that found you, made up of people who are self-aware and want to find a way to go back home. And the group that opposes them, called the Musicians. They want to stay in Mobius and live in this virtual paradise, and hunt down the Go Home Club, fearing that people leaving will destabilize the virtual world and destroy it. Of course, the original game story was just about the Go Home Club opposing the Musicians and trying to find a way back home. But with Overdose's new story content, you're actually able to see both sides of this conflict. And that's something I really like about the story of Overdose, because you don't often get to see both good and quote-unquote bad sides of the same conflict. The main unfortunate thing here is the fact that the story has a very slow pace to it. I'd say I was playing the game for at least 3 or 4 hours before the Musicians were properly introduced, and I had a good grasp on how the game flowed. Now, of course, once you get to that 3 to 5 hour mark, everything gets a lot better. The pacing increases, you get a lot more character events, and all in all, it just feels like a much more interesting story. But you've got to trudge through 3 to 5 hours of very slow pacing to get there. When it comes to gameplay, this is a turn-based RPG with dungeon crawling and some social elements thrown into the mix. In every chapter of the game, you're going to be constantly running through dungeons, taking part in turn-based battles, and having access to do optional character events for not only the main cast, but a lot of other NPCs in this world. Now, first order of business. Overdose is a remake with a lot of new features that were not available on the PS Vita. These new features include a female protagonist with a lot of story variations, kind of like when you could choose a female protagonist in Persona 3 Portable, new playable characters on both the Go Home Club and Musician sides, a new story route for the Musicians so you can see their perspective on things, multiple endings, and some post-game options in the form of a boss rematch feature and party organization feature, letting you take characters from both the Go Home Club and the Musicians to form a single battle party. Now here's how progression works. In each chapter you've got a new dungeon for the Go Home Club to go through to find a boss fight and advance the story to the next chapter. But you've also got some optional stuff that you can do in the form of character events. Every member of the cast essentially has a quest line of character events that you can go through that'll slowly unlock as you go through the actual story of the game. These are essentially like social links from the Persona games, where you learn more about the character and you've got dialogue choices where you can get the choice right and continue advancing down that quest line to get their ultimate skill, or you can fail and miss out on all that. You can also miss out on a character's entire quest line, because if it pops up and you don't do it within so many chapters, it'll completely disappear and you won't be able to try again until New Game Plus. And with this being Overdose with the Musicians route, if you go onto the Musicians route, you actually have twice as much stuff to do. You have 2 story dungeons to go through, one for the Go Home Club and one for the Musicians. And each chapter also gives you new character quests for the main cast of the Musicians on top of the main cast of the Go Home Club. Of course, that's not all. You also have over 500 random NPCs that are around all of the game's areas that you can also befriend and recruit into your party. This has a unique system because not everybody can just be walked up to and recruited and start their little quest. Some of them you actually have to befriend their friends in their class before that you can befriend them. This system would be a really neat thing if the characters were more unique. All 500 of these characters basically look like the exact same character model with a different hairstyle or gender applied to them. Outside of a short 2 or 3 minute quest line attached to each of them, they basically look like 500 copies of the same generic character who use the same weapons and skills as the main cast. They all just feel too bland. Now let's get into the actual dungeon crawling. As I said earlier, every area of the game basically acts as a dungeon, full of NPCs, enemies, and items that you can grab as accessories to equip to your party. This is where the game really starts to feel like Persona. All the floors of each dungeon look pretty much the same and enemies are wandering around, so you can attack them or you can sneak around them. Now when you get into battle, you've got a turn-based system with commands for attacks and skills like most other RPGs. But when you put it in a command for battle, you actually get a little preview of what's going to happen, as well as a slider to put in a delay for when your attack actually goes through. Basically letting you get around the enemy's actions, letting your attack delay until their guard is down so it doesn't get absorbed and actually does damage to them. And there's also simplicity here because there's no item system and no weapon upgrade system. As such, you gain a lot of stats when you level up to compensate for the fact that you don't have new weapons, and instead of having you collect healing items for dungeon treks, you're healed at the end of every battle. Now as this all comes together, let's talk about content and length, which may not be as much as you expect, but still a decent amount for an RPG. Even with all of the added content, I did all of the character events for about half the roster, mostly just my favorite characters, and I got to the final boss in around 20 to 25 hours. Now let's dive into presentation, which has its good points and has its bad points. When you got the game in docked mode, everything is nice and detailed, though the character models do get a little blurry when they're really close to the camera. But when you've got it in handheld mode, the character models are considerably downgraded and look very, very blurry no matter where they are. Now when it comes to performance, it is pretty smooth overall, though one dungeon does have some slowdown and there are some light frame drops when you first go into battle. Now when we get into Battery Life, I was expecting it to be a bit more because of how downgraded the character models are, but the Caligula effect Overdose has a battery range of 2 hours and 26 minutes on high settings, up to 2 hours and 49 minutes on low settings. Acceptable, but not as much as I was thinking. Now in conclusion, the Caligula effect comes to the Switch with a lot of new characters and choices, offering a pretty interesting story, fun combat, and the uniqueness of being able to see both sides of the conflict around the game's story. Now on the downside, the story has a very sluggish pace at the beginning, handheld mode really downgrades the character models, and the NPC recruitment system's blandness is really disappointing. Now despite these flaws, it does remain to be an interesting RPG. Not a great RPG, but a pretty decent one. Reviews to Go rates the Caligula effect Overdose for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below or head to the website at reviewstogo.com.